How do you make sure your kids are getting the best education in Hawaii? We'll talk about that coming up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? I always get asked about schools in Hawaii and how do I make sure my kids are going to the best schools? How do I pick an area that are going to have good schools for my kids? And this is somewhat of a complicated topic. And so I'm going to share some perspective and a couple of recommendations with you coming from my personal perspective, right? So I went to public school here in Hawaii. My kids go to public school here in Hawaii. And my wife was a public school teacher for like 16 years. So we have a little bit of personal experience with it, and that's where this advice is coming from. You're gonna find a lot of different opinions about this, and if you're looking at just purely school rankings, you can look on any of Google school rankings. There's a bunch of different services that will give you a ranking of schools online and an evaluation. Most of that is based on test scores or maybe student to teacher ratios and different things, but more kind of data driven, right? And I'm going to talk about some other things to consider when thinking about your kids' education here in Hawaii. And the first one is there's basically two options, right? Like anywhere else, there's public school and there's private school. Depending where you live, if you're on Oahu, there's a lot of private school options. They're very pricey. If you live on the Big Island, there's a lot less public school options. Neighbor islands have a lot less private school options. And so that may drive where you buy. If you want to have access to one of those private schools, you may want to buy closer to where those are so you have access to them and the commute isn't very far. But in most cases, most kids are going to go to public school on the Big Island. It's just way more accessible. And so some things that you want to consider just to first understand about the Hawaii public school system is that it is not funded by property taxes. We are one of the only jurisdictions in America that schools are not funded by property taxes. Schools are funded by the general fund. And so in a lot of places, people look at, county by county school districts or communities, and the property taxes have an effect on the kind of funding the schooling gets. And that's not the case in Hawaii. The schools all get somewhat of equal funding, irregardless of where they're located, very rural or in town, because they are funded by the general fund. So the actual real estate around a school doesn't directly impact the funding that a school gets, but what it does impact is the type of demographic that's around that school, right? If you're in a higher end area, in most cases the people in those areas are going to be a higher socioeconomic means, and the kids that go to those schools are going to come from those families. And so that's where you're going to have an effect on real estate prices and the economy around you on what the school looks like. But from a funding standpoint, it doesn't have a direct impact in terms of what your property taxes are, what the property values are, and the schools. So all in all, what I would like to convey here is I have like 3 pieces of advice to kind of think about, because you really are going to end up where you end up, and you're going to have access to the schools that are around you. And so instead of trying to look at some objective kind of measure or ranking of a school, my advice from a parent standpoint and just from living in Hawaii is that there's kind of 3 things that you want to think about when you send your kids to school and how to get the best education for them, right? And the first one is obviously to be involved in your kids' education, right? Be engaged, understand what they're doing, understand what's going on at the school. Every single school, no matter where you're at, is going to have AP and honors classes, and so gifted and talented programs. Those are things that you can push your kids towards in order to enhance their education, even if they're out of public school, and give them a more rigorous education while they're there. But again, that's something that a parent really has to drive and be engaged in and understand and help facilitate, so your kids are going in the right direction and having access to those programs when they're available. All right, so the second one is really getting to know the school and the teachers specifically through your community. So if you're new to the community, you may want to make friends with peers that have kids in those schools, or maybe have kids that have gone through the school maybe a little bit ahead of yours, so you can get some reconnaissance on the teachers. One of the things you can do in Hawaii is you can request your child's teacher for the next year. And what happens is, if you do it early, you can almost always get your kid into a certain class, and it can make a big difference, right? Especially like in elementary school, you may have 4 teachers in one grade level. One may be a really outstanding teacher that you need to know that so you can request your child being in their class the following year. But the only way you're really going to know that is being involved in your school and maybe getting some feedback from your peers that have had kids that have gone through those schools. So that's one thing that, I saw year after year after year, as my wife always did a good job because she was an insider in the school, requesting teachers the following year for our kids, and our kids usually got the best teacher in that grade level because you can have a very wide array of teachers and quality of teachers in the same grade level. So the school doesn't really matter as much as the individual teacher, right? And so that's something that you definitely want to get involved in and understand and try and set yourself up for success going forward. And then the last one is just think about focusing on things outside of the actual in the school education, right? And something that we try and focus heavily on is extracurricular activities. There's other things that you can do outside of school that can enrich your child's education. And for example, there are programs like Kumon, which is an enrichment activity that you pay for, privately, but it helps kids with reading and math, fundamental reading and math, and can really push them, and in elementary set them up for success in higher grade levels because it can be pushed beyond where they're at in their actual public school education because it's a little bit more advanced and a little bit more rigorous. There's other things like every community is going to have other types of enrichment programs. We have one called Aloha Maps here on the Big Island that provides early college education, all kinds of cultural enrichment activities. You can even get a associate's degree by the time you graduate high school by doing classes after school or during the breaks and during the summer. For high school kids, they can earn enough college credits to get their associates before they graduate high school. And so there are things like that you want to look into. There are all kinds of community activities out there. The Kona Historical Society, for example, has all kinds of enrichment activities where kids can learn about the culture and do their genealogy and look into the history of Kona and their family's history here if their family is from here. So there's many different opportunities for kids to get education outside of the walls of a school, and that's something that you really want to consider in how you spend your time and what your kids do outside of school. Because for me, I learned a lot about life outside of actually going to school through having mentors and people that taught me about life and carpentry and plumbing and all these different things that you need to learn how to do in life, and that's not necessarily something that you may learn inside of school. So think about that. What are the options to do that, and don't just focus on what is my kid gonna do when they go to school. What are some things outside of school that they can work on and can help further their education. So just a couple of things to consider when looking at schools in Hawaii outside of like just the I'm gonna look at the rankings and the test scores and those types of data driven rankings, because there's a lot more that goes into it. So if you have any questions, of course, you can always book a meeting at the link below or email me at dylan@buyabigisland.com and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week. Aloha.